All right, let's get right into it. We're tackling a really powerful, maybe even controversial idea today. It's based on an analysis that says if you really want to understand what's happening in American politics, you have to look way past the daily headlines. The core argument here: the problem isn't just about one person. It's about a deep psychological pattern that's been building for almost 100 years.
So let's just start with the big, provocative question right up front. If Donald Trump just disappeared from the political scene tomorrow, poof, gone, would America's problems be fixed? Would all the anger, the division, all the chaos just fade away? Would the country just snap back to normal? It's a question a lot of people are asking.
Well, according to the analysis we're breaking down today, the answer is a clear and simple no. In fact, it argues that thinking one person is the entire problem is a dangerously simple way of looking at things. The real issue, this analysis claims, is something it calls a national psychological illness. And in this view, Trump isn't the disease. He's just the loudest and most obvious symptom. Pretty wild diagnosis, right?
So to really understand this diagnosis, we're going to walk through it step by step. First, we'll tackle that big question: is Trump the cause or just a symptom? Then we'll define the core illness the source points to, what it calls America's omnipotence fantasy. After that, we'll see how that fantasy creates this destructive loop of failure by betrayal, how Trump fits into all this, and how it's all crashing against a world that has totally changed. And finally, we'll look at the pretty sobering prediction for what might come next.
Okay, so let's dive into part one. Is Donald Trump the cause of everything we're seeing, or is he just a symptom of something that was already there? I mean, this is the most important question, really, because the answer changes everything. It tells you if there's a quick fix or if the problem is much, much bigger.
Now, the story we hear all the time, both in the US and around the world, is that Trump is basically a bug in the system. You know, an error, a glitch in the code. And the logic there is simple. If you just get rid of the bug, the whole system just reboots and everything goes back to the way it was. In this view, he's the source of the chaos, the polarization, all of it. Simple problem, right? Simple solution.
But the analysis we're using for this explainer, which comes from the New York Times, offers a completely different and kind of chilling alternative. It says Trump is not the bug. He's a feature of the underlying code. The idea is that he's a perfect reflection of something that a huge part of the country already wanted. He didn't write the script. The script was already there, just waiting for someone like him to come along and read the lines.
Okay, so if he's just a symptom, then what's the actual disease? Well, this brings us to the core diagnoses from our source. It's this idea called the omnipotence fantasy. And it's something scholars have been talking about for a while, but it might be showing up now in a really powerful new way.
So what on earth is the omnipotence fantasy? Well, it's this deep-seated, maybe even unconscious, national belief that America is just special, different, that it's inherently invincible, always on the right side of history, and that it has this unique destiny to shape and control what happens in the world. It's the feeling that America can't really fail, and if something does go wrong, it can't possibly be America's own fault.
Now, a belief that strong doesn't just pop up out of thin air. The source argues it grew out of a very unique set of circumstances. You had geographic isolation, oceans protecting the country, huge profits from 2 world wars while others were destroyed, an incredible amount of natural resources. All of this was fueled by the powerful idea of manifest destiny. And then, the final piece: after the Cold War ended, America was the last superpower standing, unchallenged. And that, the argument goes, is when the fantasy hit its absolute peak. For a little while, total power and control didn't even seem like a fantasy. It seemed real.
Okay, so if this omnipotence fantasy is the core problem, how does it keep going? I mean, how does it protect itself from reality? Well, like any psychological condition, it has a defense mechanism. And in this case, the source says it's a really powerful and destructive cycle. Let's look at how this thing actually works. This is the key. Pay attention to this loop. Step 1, the nation acts, based on this belief in its own unlimited power. Step 2, it fails, because it runs headfirst into a complicated reality that doesn't care about the fantasy. Now, here's the crucial part. Step 3. Instead of questioning the fantasy itself, the blame gets turned inward. The failure is explained away as the fault of traitors, saboteurs, or weaklings inside the country. And the result? The original fantasy is never corrected. In fact, it gets stronger. And the whole cycle is ready to start all over again with absolutely nothing learned. And the source argues this isn't just a theory. You can see this pattern play out over and over again. Think about it. After losing China to communism in the 50s, you get McCarthyism, a hunt for communists at home. After the defeat in Vietnam, who got the blame? Anti-war protesters and weak-kneed politicians, not the idea of the war itself. Fast forward to the 2000s. The endless wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were blamed on bad intelligence or poor leadership, rarely on the flawed idea that you could just remake these countries. And more recently, economic struggles get blamed on globalist elites selling out the country. You see the pattern? When reality bites, the explanation is always betrayal from within.
This is a really different way of looking at history, right? But I gotta ask, what do you think? Does this failure by betrayal idea make sense to you? Does it hold up when you think about these events? Or are there other, more important factors being missed here? I'm really curious to hear what you think, so drop your thoughts in the comments below.
And all of this brings us right back to today, and right back to Donald Trump. The analysis we're looking at argues that if you think of America as a patient with this long-running condition, then Trump is the sudden, high-fever, can't-miss-it symptom. He is, essentially, the omnipotence fantasy made flesh.
And look at this comparison on the slide. It's pretty stunning. On the left, you have the features of the national fantasy. It believes it never truly fails, it's only betrayed. On the right, Donald Trump's persona, which is built on never, ever admitting a mistake or a loss. The fantasy believes it's always morally right. Trump's message, I alone can fix it. The fantasy thinks rules are for other people. Trump famously challenges democratic norms. And the absolute key, the fantasy blames internal enemies for every problem. Trump blames fake news, the deep state, and his political rivals. According to the source, it's almost a perfect mirror.
So the big point here is that he didn't invent this mindset. He just showed up at the exact right moment to tap into all that resentment that was already simmering under the surface. He told people that their feeling of being betrayed was real, that it was valid, and then he used it masterfully to fuel his own rise. He wasn't the cause, he was the consequence.
So you've got this powerful psychological force inside the country. But of course, none of this is happening in a vacuum. The world outside America's borders has been changing, fast, and it's creating a harsh new environment where this old fantasy is starting to look more and more out of place.
I mean, let's be real, the 21st century world is not the world of 1995. It's not unipolar anymore, it's multipolar. You've got countries in Asia and the Middle East carving out their own paths. You have America's oldest allies in Europe talking about strategic autonomy, which is code for being less dependent on the US. The Global South is demanding a bigger seat at the table, and in this new world, America's old toolbox, things like sanctions and threats, they just don't work like they used to.
And while the world is changing on the outside, there are huge pressures building on the inside. This chart, based on Federal Reserve data, just lays it bare. The bottom 50% of the American population, half the country, holds only 2.5% of the nation's wealth. Just think about that. When half the people feel completely left behind, it's the perfect breeding ground for that failure by betrayal loop. It becomes so much easier to blame some internal enemy for your problems than to face a complicated and maybe unfair economic system.
So what do you get when you combine a rigid national mindset that refuses to learn from mistakes with a world that no longer plays by the old rules and deep, painful divisions at home? Well, this brings us to the final and, frankly, the most troubling part of this whole analysis, the prognosis for the future.
The source warrants that this could all lock the country into a vicious cycle, a kind of downward spiral. Here's how it would work. First, a new challenge pops up somewhere in the world. Second, driven by that old fantasy, the nation responds with arrogant overreach. Third, because that response is out of touch with reality, it fails. Fourth, that failure makes the finger-pointing and blame game at home even worse. Fifth, all that infighting erodes America's actual power and credibility on the world stage. And then, the country faces the next challenge from an even weaker position, ready to repeat the exact same mistakes all over again.
And this brings us to the ultimate takeaway from this whole analysis. The most important question for America's future isn't about who wins the next election. It's not about who's sitting in the Oval Office. The real, fundamental question is whether the nation as a whole can wake up from this century-old fantasy and start to see itself and the world as they really are.
And that leaves us with this one last huge question to think about. Is it even possible for an entire country to break a psychological habit that's been baked into its identity for so long? Or is it destined to just keep repeating the cycle of pride, failure, and blame until there's nothing left? It's a heavy thought to end on.
Whew! I know that was a lot to take in, but I hope this breakdown gave you a totally new way to think about what you see in the news. If you found this useful, do me a favor and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and make sure you ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next explainer. We're always trying to get past the surface level stuff. Thanks so much for watching.